Well, after 2 years of being super careful, mask wearing, social distancing, using endless amounts of hand sanitizer, it finally happened. I caught coronavirus. Now, luckily, it was pretty mild. I breezed through it very straightforwardly. It was totally okay. So I thought it would be really useful for me to make this video talking about my experience of having COVID, especially at this critical time for England in the pandemic, where we're moving out of the crazy pandemic phase into the more endemic phase. Coming up, I'll talk you through what my symptoms were like during my illness, and I'll reflect on some of the lessons that I learnt from having COVID, especially as the country now learns to live with the virus. But first, after 2 years of escaping it, how on earth did I catch it? You see, the irony to this situation is that for all the talk of staying at home and protecting the NHS and not meeting with friends and limiting your social contacts, I actually caught COVID by staying at home, not from going out, because I caught COVID from a family member. If I'd gone out, or let's say if I was still at university and this person in my family tested positive, all I would have had to have done was pack my bags, head up to Leicester, isolate for a few days in case I'd caught it, but likelihood is I wouldn't have caught it and I'd have been good to go. The fact that I was at home isolating and didn't leave the house much in the first few days before actually myself testing positive, that is the reason why I ended up catching it. So in terms of me testing positive, I took daily lateral flow tests. I did that for about 3 to 4 days, and then I think on the 4th day, I had a very faint line by the T on the lateral flow test, which means it was a faint positive result. I was completely asymptomatic at the time, felt completely fine, but that was the first time that I tested positive. Then the following night, about 2 in the morning, I woke up and had a little bit of a sore throat and a bit of congestion in my nose, and that's when the symptoms began. That morning, took another lateral flow test, and the line by the T, think about this, right? Think about how crazy this was. The line wasn't even red, as it's normally supposed to be. It was black. That is how you know things have not gone to plan, right? That is how you know it's serious. The line was black. The viral load of my infection must have been astronomically high for it to come up so dark on the test. But it was crazy because for me, the infection was all in the nose, right? And that's one of the characteristics of Omicron. It's one of the reasons why I wasn't very surprised that I ended up getting COVID, because Omicron is so transmissible, right? Obviously, for it to be this transmissible, it needs to replicate faster in the nose because that's how it spreads most of the time. But it was all up here. The congestion, the runny nose, all of that stuff, that is where the virus really was for me. It felt pretty much just like a cold. And I attribute that partly down to the fact that Omicron is milder, but also because I was triple jabbed. The booster shot really did come in handy, but more on that later. I would say the infection was only really bad for about 4 hours, right? For about 4 hours on the Sunday, the day that I had that really bad positive result, I had a really nasty headache, was literally flat in bed, couldn't really do anything, just in bed, head down on the pillow, screaming in pain. It wasn't very pleasant, but I ended up getting up. I managed to eat half of my lunch that day, which was 2 fish fingers and half a pack of frozen veg. And with that, I was then able to take 2 paracetamols, and then about a few hours after that, early evening, literally the headache vanished, and from then, I basically felt fine. It wasn't anything crazy. The worst it was just a really nasty headache. So the congestion was still there for the next few days, and that gradually eased. Runny nose was still there. Sore throat eased up quite quickly, actually. The headache basically vanished. But other than that, it wasn't really too bad. The interesting thing, though, is that when you look at the NHS symptoms list, that is clearly absolutely out of date. The official symptoms listed on the NHS website are high temperature, new and continuous cough, or loss of sense of taste and smell. I only ended up having one of those, which was the cough, but that came right at the end of my illness. That was the last symptom that I experienced. Before that, it was literally all cold symptoms. Didn't have one fever and didn't lose my sense of taste or smell at all. Instead, what I had was sore throat, runny nose, headache, big congestion. Congestion up here was the big thing for me, right? But none of the other main symptoms other than the cough, but that came last. And this is something that has been highlighted ever since the summer, actually, with the emergence of the Delta variant. When double vaccinated people started catching the Delta variant, it was noted then that the symptoms were changing. People were getting runny noses and headaches and sore throats and that sort of thing. But even still, the government is yet to change the definition of symptoms. And at the time, that was meaning that certain people weren't being tested because they didn't have the official symptoms, when in fact they did have COVID, but it was going unnoticed. And so it's very important, if you have any of the cold-like symptoms like I had, you really should get a test, because you never know, you might be carrying it, you might infect someone vulnerable, and obviously you don't want to do that. But as far as I'm concerned, I breezed through the worst of it in about 4 hours. After that, it was only onwards and upwards, and I was pretty much completely fine, to be honest. My illness with coronavirus came at an absolutely pivotal moment in England's pandemic journey, because it came during the week when Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced his Learning to Live with COVID plan, which removed all domestic COVID restrictions, including the mandatory requirement to self-isolate after a positive test. Absolutely extraordinary. For 2 years, it had been mandatory to self-isolate with a positive test. Well, after the 24th of February, that was no longer the case. And this really does raise the question of, what does the future look like with COVID in England, when people who are COVID positive can just go out and mingle, amongst the rest of society? It's a very, very interesting question. But I have to tell you, I do think the Prime Minister made the right decision here to lift all COVID restrictions. And really, it's because in the last 2 years, the science has changed absolutely fundamentally. We are now in a position where 92% of over 12s in the UK have had at least one dose of the vaccine, with 66%, 38 million people, having had their booster shot. Those numbers are just absolutely extraordinary. That is a high amount of immunity in the population. At some point, we do have to move on from draconian restrictions. And I understand I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this. I know there's a lot of people who say we must, maintain restrictions. We must keep masks all the time. We must social distance all the time. We have to move on at some point. The vaccination, it was made very clear. Go back, look at the statements by the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty. He was very clear. The vaccination is the way out of this. That is how we're going to get ourselves out of the pandemic. I was triple jabbed when I caught COVID. It was like a cold. Omicron is milder than the other variants. If you are boosted, Omicron is a cold. Literally, you'll catch it, you'll feel ill for a couple of hours, take a paracetamol, headache will go, you will breeze through it like it's not really a big deal, right? It's absolutely wonderful. The booster shot, it clearly worked. It really did take the edge off my infection, and I really would not have wanted to have COVID without the booster, or frankly without my first 2 doses either. So we're in a position now where the vaccine's available to everyone. You've had well over a year now. People my age have had about 7-8 months to have it. If you haven't had it by now and you get severely ill, that's kind of your problem now. I'm protected. I've had the 3 jabs. Now I've had Omicron, the natural booster, my natural immunity, on top of the vaccine immunity. I mean, I'm pretty much superhuman at this point. I'm going about my daily life, no longer wearing a mask, no longer having to social distance from my friends, because we are learning to live with COVID. That is the reality. That is where we are as a country with our high vaccination rates. We've got to take advantage of it. And for folks who may be immunocompromised and maybe a bit more cautious about the easing of restrictions, remember, you are able to get extra vaccinations. The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has recommended that you are eligible for 4 vaccine doses, with a 5th coming in the spring. Antivirals are huge. They're going to stop severe illness as long as you are able to detect the virus early in the infection. You'll be able to get access to antivirals and things like that. So there are options out there. The science is out there. The tools have changed from where we were 2 years ago. 2 years ago, there was no vaccination, no antivirals. 2 years later, we have 92% of the population with at least 1 dose, 38 million boosters, antivirals readily available, completely free of charge. We have to take advantage of the new tools that we have, and I don't think that there is a place for rules and mandates and legislation anymore in this country. But that's only because we're fortunate, because we have such high vaccination rates. If you look at most of the European continent, it's not the same position. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, a lot of nonsense being spread around, and so they've had to take more draconian measures with vaccine mandates, with vaccine passports in restaurants and stuff like that, which in principle, I'm completely fine with if it means that people are kept safe. Really, it's the unvaccinated that are protected by those measures, because even if vaccinated people catch it, we're not the ones going to hospital. We're going to have mild illness and it'll be fine. For the unvaccinated, only the Lord knows what will happen if they get COVID. And so that is the reality. That is where we're at. We have to move on. I think that as a country now, I'm triple jabbed, had COVID now, got the Omicron antibodies. It's completely wonderful, and we have to move on and learn to live with it. The other key thing about the vaccination specifically is just the amount of peace of mind it gives you, knowing that your family members are going to be completely fine because they've had their 3 jabs. At no point in the days leading up to my positive test was I ever worried about my family member ending up in hospital or on a ventilator, because I knew they'd had their 3 jabs. So I just carried on pretty much as normal, wasn't too worried. And trust me, that is a feeling that only when you experience it, you then realise, wow, science is incredible. Vaccines are incredible. Don't listen to the nonsense on Facebook. Ignore it. It's all rubbish. I'm telling you, knowing that your closest family members are going to be safe and protected if they catch COVID because they have their 3 doses, it is a feeling unlike anything else. And trust me, if you get into that position, or if you have been in that position, you will understand exactly what I'm talking about. Well, those are just a few thoughts on my experience of having COVID and my views on the Learning to Live with COVID plan. But tell me, what do you think about the Prime Minister's decision here to learn to live with COVID? Do you think it was the right one, or are you vulnerable and a bit worried about the return to normal? Do let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Darshan Leslie, and I will see you next video.